Welcome back to our Cold Working 101 video series. Today we're going to discuss sandblasters. One just sticks down into the hopper, a more frosty appearance on the surface, a deeper sandblast etch into that, blasted all the way through our tungsten nozzle and all the way through our gun assembly. Now before we get talking about sandblasters, we really need to talk first about air compressors. They're really going to be the most important thing when you start looking at purchasing a sandblaster. A sandblaster is basically just a metal box for the most part. There's not a whole lot of variation in those. There's a little bit in the pickup and the delivery system inside a sandblaster, which we'll cover. But the most important part of your sandblasting system is going to be your air compressor. You're going to need a really big air compressor to work a sandblaster. This is a two-stage air compressor here with about an 80-gallon tank. So it's really quite big. It's going to push at 150 psi, probably about 80 CFM of air. That's cubic foot per minute of air. Now the majority of your sandblast cabinets, the larger cabinet like we're going to talk about today, is generally going to take about 14 CFM of air to run that sandblaster adequately at about 90 psi. You can get smaller cabinets or smaller nozzles that will take it down to about 5 CFM, so you can use somewhat of a smaller air compressor with your sandblaster, but you're also going to be sandblasting much slower. So in a larger cabinet, you really do want to stick with about that 14 CFM nozzle to get enough air and blast material going through that gun to adequately blast a larger surface. So let's talk about air compressors. Now this, like I said, is a two-stage, 220-volt air compressor with about an 80-gallon tank. That means you're going to have this hardwired into your system with a direct connection to a 220 single-phase line. You cannot just plug these things into the wall. You're going to have to get an electrician to put this in and attach directly to a 220 line. Once you have your compressor done and in place, there are a couple of things we need to go over, and let's talk about those real quick. Now, one of the first things you want to notice on your air compressor is your pressure gauge here. That's going to tell you how many pounds per square inch, or PSI, of air that your compressor is able to send out. Now, if you look a little closer on ours, you can see ours is about 150 PSI straight out of our tank. Well, that's a little high for sandblast use. You don't want it quite that large. Now, you could put an air pressure regulator on your line here at your tank, but what you really want to do is put a pressure regulator at your sandblaster. So let's take a look at that real quick. So we're back at our sandblast cabinet here, and you can see our air line coming in here, and we have a ball valve shutoff right here. This is very important. You want to put this in line so you can shut your air off to your sandblaster so you can work on any of the equipment coming this way or work on your sandblaster itself without cutting the air off to the rest of your shop. So we do have a ball valve shutoff for our air right there. And right here, you'll see our pressure regulator. So here you have our pressure regulator. We have our air line coming in and our air line going out. There are a number of different models of this. We have a 3/8 inch line coming in and a 3/8 going out. They also make one that's 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch. So whatever your air lines are, you'll have an attachment method that you can put this pressure regulator on. Now the dial in the middle here is going to show you the pressure at this regulator right before our sandblaster. So right now I have this set at 90 psi. With the pressure regulators, it's really easy to change this pressure. You just pull up on this little controller here. If you turn it to the right, it will increase your pressure. If you turn it to the left, it will decrease your pressure. So with your sandblaster, you really want a pressure at about 90 psi. Now it's really nice on these pressure regulators. You've got two little green arrows at the top here, and that top part, green arrow, is where you want it. That's going to be your 90 psi. Once you have it set, just lock it in place so this can't be adjusted, and you've got 90 psi of pressure per square inch coming out right before your sandblaster, and that's exactly where you want this to be. Another nice part of this pressure regulator is it has a built-in water trap here as well. Your compressor is going to create a lot of moisture, especially if you are in a high humidity area. The way the pressurized tank does, it's going to generate a lot of moisture. There's going to be water that gets into your air lines. You don't want that water getting into your sandblast material. It'll actually clump up your abrasive. It'll make it hard to blast. Things will just not work right. So this little unit here is nice, is it has an automated water trap on it. So there's a float inside here, and when water builds up enough inside this trap, it will open an air line at the bottom here and evacuate that water with the air pressure that's in the regulator here. So it's really nice. You don't have to pay that much attention to it, and it will keep water out of your system. Now on your pressure regulator, on your pressure gauge, if you put it at that top green one, that's about 90 psi. Now when you sandblast, that's actually going to drop. So your pressure, your pounds per square inch of air, your PSI will drop as you're using the sandblaster because air is flowing through the line. Typically, you want to see that only drop about 5 PSI, so move from 90 to 85. If it drops significantly more, you need to check your lines or maybe even up the pressure right before your sandblaster. There may be a leak somewhere where pressure is escaping. But you generally want to see only about a drop of about 5 PSI from 90 to 85 when you're working with your sandblaster. Now we've mentioned that a sandblaster, because of the pressurized air in here, will actually start collecting a lot of moisture. So that will generally fall to the bottom of your tank. So we're down here on the floor, and underneath our tank, there is actually just a little valve here that will open up an air pressure valve on the bottom of our tank. This will allow the air pressure that's in our tank to flush the water out of the tank. Typically, you want to do this at least once a month, but if you're in a high humidity area or if you use your air compressor a lot, once a week may actually be a good idea to clear this out. And it's very, very simple to do. You simply reach underneath and open up that valve a little bit. And you can see the water escaping from your tank. Once more air comes out than water, it's time to close that valve, get rid of this wastewater, and your tank's clean. Now we've talked about already that sandblasters are fairly simple pieces of equipment. It's basically a metal cabinet that has an input, it carries grit, and has an output with the dust collector. So they're not very complicated. Once you've got your compressor set up, and then make sure it's going to provide enough air pressure, enough cubic feet per minute of air at the right pounds per square inch, then let's take a look at our cabinet, which is very, very basic. You have two parts for most cabinets. You have the sandblast cabinet itself, and you have the dust collector. So the dust collector has a line that comes out of the cabinet and into the collection. You've got a filter bag here and another filter in the top where the vacuum motor is. This turns on, creates a vacuum, and it sucks the smaller, lighter weight debris out of your sandblast cabinet and collects it here for you to empty. Depending how often you use your cabinet, you may need to change this fairly often to keep everything running quite efficiently. So we're taking a look inside of our cabinet now. I've lifted the lid. We have what is called a top opening cabinet that has a top piece that will open up along with a side door. Now this cabinet is what is called a siphon-fed cabinet. That means there is grit in the bottom hopper down here, and as air pressure flows through this line, it will pick up grit and air from the hopper and blow through our nozzle here. So it siphons the grit from the hopper in the bottom with the air pressure and pulls it and blows it out of our nozzle. Now these are the most common type of sandblasters that you can buy, being a siphon-fed cabinet. They're not as powerful as another type model that you can get called a pressurized sandblast cabinet or a pressure pot. That's where the grit is actually inside the pot under pressure with the air. So it tends to want to blow out faster with more consistency in the air pressure and more efficiency in the sandblasting. So they're really nice additions to have if you do a lot of sandblasting and you need that consistency from your sandblast cabinet. Pressure pots typically hold about 50 to 100 pounds of grit, abrasive material, so you do have to change that out a little more often as it's not recycled back into the hopper. It's recycled into your cabinet as you work your sandblaster. So let's take a look at the mechanics of our little gun here. So you can see our sandblast gun here has a couple of different parts to it. This is our air line that goes in from our air compressor through our foot pedal assembly that controls the airflow. So as the air comes through our gun assembly here, it will create a siphon that pulls from this tube that goes down into our grit. Now in our gun assembly here, we have our nozzle. This is a tungsten carbide nozzle, so they have a good long lifespan to them. Most sandblast cabinets are going to come standard with a ceramic nozzle on them. Those will burn through pretty quickly. The tungsten carbide nozzles will last a little bit longer, so you don't have to change them quite as often. But you do want to really pay attention to your sandblast nozzles and make sure that you're not burning through them and blowing through them very quickly. The grit will wear away your nozzle just the same way it wears away your glass as you sandblast it. To give you an idea, let me show you one of our old gun assemblies where we didn't pay attention to what we were doing. So here is our older sandblast gun assembly here, and you can see there's our intake from the grit. There is where our air line attaches, and there is our tungsten carbide nozzle. But if you turn our gun around, you can see that over time, we actually blasted all the way through our tungsten nozzle and all the way through our gun assembly, and we're not really paying attention to how that was happening. We lease time out here a lot, so we have a lot of people in here using the Sandblaster. Sometimes they're not paying as close attention, and obviously we weren't either. So this is one of those things that you do want to kind of pay attention to as you're using your Sandblaster, and check your nozzle every once in a while to make sure it doesn't need to be replaced. Or you can run into a situation like this where we have blasted all the way through our tungsten nozzle and our gun and had to replace the entire gun assembly. So I've taken the screens out of our Sandblaster here to give you a better idea of how the hopper works. So typically I've got a metal screen in here, and then I've got a plastic grid screen on top of that because I don't want my glass banging around on the metal screen that's in here. So I have a plastic one that I put on top of it just so that's easier to wear away and break, and I can change over time. But you'll get an idea here how this works, and you can see our pickup line here that goes down into our hopper, into our pickup rod here, and actually in the bottom of the hopper you can see all of our loose abrasive in there. So this is a 220 grit silicon carbide that we keep in here, and your pickup wand just sticks into that abrasive down into the hopper. And I'll show you a different wand real quick to give you an idea how that works. So here's the bottom piece of what the pickup wand looks like. Our air hose would actually attach to this part of the wand, and then this kind of spiked into the wand goes down into our loose grit silicon carbide. You'll notice on these wands there's a little hole here. This is your air pickup. So when you have your tube on the end of this and you have air pressure going, this pulls air in and allows the bottom of the wand in your loose grit abrasive to siphon or suck abrasive up through this. So you don't want to cover this up. You don't want to have the little hole underneath your abrasive in your sandblast cabinet. So the wands come with this little piece of tubing on here that you can adjust. You want to leave that below the hole, and when you stick it in your grit, don't stick your wand any further into the grit than where this tube is. So you make sure you leave your air hole open so it creates enough pressure and suction to siphon up that abrasive into your sandblast system. Now you can see we have our metal grid back in here. I'm going to show you our plastic grid real quick. And this is basically just a plastic material that you use in fluorescent ceiling lights. So you can pick this up from most hardware stores really inexpensively. Just snap it and cut it to fit. And make sure you snap a little corner here for where your air hoses are. And we're just going to slide this on top of our metal table in here. So now my glass can go on top of this plastic, and it's not going to damage the glass as I'm sandblasting it and moving it inside the cabinet from rubbing against or banging against the metal grid. Now when it comes to the Sandblaster itself, it's really quite easy to hook up. You have your air line coming from your compressor to your pressure regulator with your water trap, or if you get a separate pressure regulator, you want to make sure to get a water trap on your system as well. The air line goes into a foot pedal system that then goes up into the cabinet here and over to your wand inside the cabinet. That's pretty basic and pretty simple. The only electrical requirement really is the light bulb inside the cabinet. That's the only electrical part of the actual cabinet itself. Now your compressor will need that 220 direct line, so that's a little more involved electrically, but your sandblast cabinet is pretty simple. All you need is a 110 for your light inside the cabinet so you can see what you're doing. Now when you're sandblasting, it will generate a lot of static electricity from the sandblast material going through the gun and through the cabinet. So you do want to get a mat that has a grounding wire on it and put it into a ground. Otherwise, you're going to get some electrical shock from the cabinet itself. That's not from the wall outlet. That is just static electricity that is building up inside the cabinet from the abrasive material moving through the cabinet. It won't kill you because it's a bit uncomfortable. That's about it. So it's really good just to pick up a grounding mat to ground yourself as you're sandblasting to avoid having those little shocks from the cabinet if you happen to touch metal parts of the cabinet while you're blasting. Now, we've talked about a grounding mat for your cabinet to keep you from getting little minor shocks from the electrostatic energy being generated inside the cabinet as you're blasting. Another addition that you can add to your cabinet is a little vibration motor. Now, we've talked about how all your grit is down in the hopper here of the sandblast cabinet, and as you blast and the grit is blasting your glass and recycling back into your hopper, it tends to want to stay at the top of the hopper. Well, your pickup is generally at the bottom of the hopper. So you'll oftentimes start running low on grit because it's all at the top of the hopper and it's not moving its way down as you're blasting. One way to solve that is to put on this little vibration motor that we've just mounted to the leg of our sandblaster. This gives low vibration, which will vibrate this cabinet slightly as you're blasting and help the media in your hopper slowly move back down to the bottom of your hopper as you're sandblasting, so you don't have to worry about constantly opening up your cabinet, trying to push your grit back down into the hopper, or banging your cabinet to try and get it go back down. Just mounting this little vibration unit onto the leg of your sandblaster with enough vibration to get your grit flowing to the bottom of the hopper on a regular basis. You do not want to mount this directly to the cabinet or to the hopper. Most of your sandblast cabinets are a double-walled steel, so if you drill through this and try and mount this, you're going to have a lot of grit and mess go through the interior wall of your double-walled steel. So mounting it to the leg is the easiest, most simplistic way to do it without compromising the integrity of your sandblast cabinet. We'll get a lot of people ask us what the best abrasive to use in your sandblast cabinet is. Typically, I will say a silicon carbide. If you've watched some of our earlier videos on how these abrasives work, silicon carbide is a very sharp abrasive, so it removes material very quickly. You can go from just surface etching your pieces to actually deep carving your pieces. If you're only looking for surface prep, you might want to consider instead an aluminum oxide abrasive. It's not nearly as sharp as the silicon carbide, so it works really well for giving you a uniform surface on a kiln piece that has just picked up texture from your kiln shelf without going too deep. And it also doesn't break down nearly as fast as the silicon carbide, so you're not going to have to replace it as often. So it's a little softer on the cabinet. Now, typically with either the aluminum oxide or the silicon carbide, I lean towards a 220 grit. It works really quite nicely for giving you that surface prep on a piece of glass or even doing some light sand carving into the piece without being overly aggressive on the sandblast cabinet and your blast nozzle itself. So you're not replacing your nozzles nearly as often with a 220 grit. We do have people that will use a 120 grit in their cabinets. It's going to eat through your nozzles a little bit faster, but it will certainly deep carve your pieces much faster if that's what you're looking to do, deep carving in your sandblaster. A 120 grit silicon carbide works fantastically for that. I tend not to recommend going any finer than a 220. The abrasive gets so fine that the dust collector actually wants to pull it out of the cabinet a little bit quicker. So it's slower to work on the glass. You lose a lot more of that abrasive from the dust collector before it's really been used to a point where it should be pulled out by the dust collector. So you're replacing your abrasive in the cabinet much more often as you're working. So that's generally where I go with that. Now, to give you an example of the difference between a 220 silicon carbide and aluminum oxide, let's take a look at a piece that we blasted with both. And we chose a bit of a darker piece of glass here to give you an idea of the difference between the aluminum oxide and the silicon carbide. So you can see on this side, we've got a 220 grit aluminum oxide blast, and it's a little bit more translucent. You can still see through the glass. So it's a very light finish on the glass. And this works well for giving yourself an even texture on your glass if you're going to go back in and fire polish again. But it's going to take a little bit longer as this is a softer abrasive, not quite as sharp as silicon carbide. So if you'll move over and look at the silicon carbide side, it's not nearly as translucent as the aluminum oxide is. It's definitely a more frosty appearance on the surface, a deeper sandblast etch into that that goes much, much faster. So you can kind of tell the difference there between those two and what you really want to get out of your sandblaster. Now that's your brief overview of a siphon-fed sandblast cabinet and what goes together to make that work. It's really important to make sure that you get a properly sized compressor. It's important that you make sure that you put your compressor together correctly. You have an air pressure regulator before your sandblast cabinet to dial that down to 90 psi. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of unexpected results from your sandblast cabinet, so you want to keep that about 90 psi. You want to make sure that you check your gun nozzles on a regular basis to make sure you're not blasting through those. And you want to make sure that you check your dust collector's filter bag and motor filter on a regular basis to make sure those don't get clogged, so your dust collector is pulling out the fine particle materials that you're creating in your sandblast cabinet instead of them coming out into your shop. So doing all of those things together makes this a fantastic piece of equipment that is really quite easy to use and quite easy to maintain, and you can do a lot of spectacular work in them.